This animation of Gojo vs Sukuna took me over 5 months to animate, and in this video I will explain to you guys how I created this animation. I also want to take a moment to thank you guys so much for all the support. The amount of views and like this video got is actually insane, and seeing so many people enjoy this project that I spent 5 months working on means a lot to me. Now, just before starting, there are two things I want to mention. The first is that this animation has exactly 169 individual cuts, and it would be impossible for me to explain in detail how I made each cut. And if I did, the video would be way too repetitive. So instead, I'll explain how I did some of the best cuts in the animation and give general explanation of how I made most of these cuts. The second thing is that the production of this animation started in February and ended in July of this year, except for these two cuts that were made back in December of 2025. But I wasn't always working full-time on this animation because of college and because I was kinda slacking off in the beginning of the production. Also, one last thing, I uploaded some of my animation cuts to my Patreon. Some are in the line art stage and others are colored, but all of them are in their original state before the compositing stage, so you can see the raw animation as it was created in FlipaClip. You'll get access to some of the best cuts from the JJK animation and other animations that I made in the past. I'll continue adding more cuts from my JJK animation, other projects and even older animations over the coming days. And if you'd like to support my work and get access to these exclusive animation files, you can check out my Patreon. With that out of the way, let's get started. The first thing I did was take a good look at the chapters I wanted to animate, and I tried to imagine how I could bring these panels to life. I asked myself, how would the drawings look if they were animated? But just before doing the storyboard, I went ahead and animated some scenes that I knew would be time consuming, like for example, the cuts for the hollow purple attack. After animating some scenes, I started the storyboard, and there are multiple reasons why I needed the storyboard. The first one is that I wanted a clear idea of what I was going to do, how the camera would pan, and how the characters would be drawn. A lot of these drawings are pretty similar to the manga, but I added shots and changed some drawings too. The other reason I needed the storyboard was because I wanted to show it to the music producer so he would have a clear idea of what to do. But I'll come back to the music and voice acting later in the video. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you guys, the storyboard was kinda rushed and poorly made, but it did help me a little bit. I didn't have to do it since I'm not working with other animators, but sometimes I can forget some of my ideas, and putting them in a storyboard is a good way to not forget them. It was also good for planning the pacing of the animation, the transitions, and the camera movement. Once the storyboard was done, I figured I needed to make the backgrounds in Procreate, and I started with stuff that I was already comfortable with, like the sky and the trees. But I have to admit, I really struggled to make the backgrounds of the city and the buildings because of how time-consuming it is, especially when I have to do the animation too. But the way I did these backgrounds is by looking at reference pictures of Shibuya and buildings in general. And I use simple shapes like cubes to imitate some of the structures I have seen, and I use some textures in Procreate as well as pictures of rocks and buildings to add the texture. I think simplifying the backgrounds helped me a lot to get a good idea of what I was going to paint, and then adding the textures and the details. It's also important to note that I wasn't remaking new buildings every single time I made a new background, because I was able to reuse a lot of structures from some of these backgrounds. Now, as you guys know, the background wasn't the most time-consuming part. It was obviously the animation, which I made in FlipaClip. Now, I didn't do everything in FlipaClip because when it was time to do the compositing, I used green screen to be able to work on After Effects, but we'll get into that later. As I said in the beginning of the video, this project has over 169 cuts and thousands of frames. And the first thing I did when I started animating was studying the work of my favorite animators. I looked at Yutaka Nakamura's work, Nozomu Abe's work, Kazuhiro Miwa's work, and many other amazing action animators. One of the things that made my animation better was the use of smears and the addition of effect animation like wind and debris. Another thing I did to improve the quality of my drawings was to constantly correct them. But since I am not a professional, a lot of drawings still have issues. The way I corrected my drawings was by flipping them horizontally, which shows you a lot of the flaws, and that allowed me to fix a lot of proportion errors. That said, many of my drawings still have errors, but if it wasn't for this correction technique, my animation and drawings would be way worse. Now let's take a look at a few cuts from the animation and go over some of the artistic choice I made in each. These cuts in the beginning of the animation show Gojo and Ichiji walking, walking, and I really want to focus on this specific cut of Gojo walking because it was really hard for me to draw. The hard part about this cut was animating the legs walking because they kept changing angles, and I had to take inspiration from some of these cuts from Shield Hero and Demon Slayer. Some of these early cuts started on paper because I was kinda bored in class and I wanted to draw, but yeah, this is one of the cuts that started on paper. I use quick pencil strokes to draw the clothes moving in the wind, and the simplicity is really what helped me to build the foundation of this animation. And once this was done, I was able to draw the clean lines and start the key animation and the in-between animation. Another cut I want to focus on is this one of Utahime, because it shows the technique I use to animate the head movement, and most importantly, the hair animation. The hair animation is definitively one of the hardest parts to animate because it requires a good understanding of how the wind affects light objects like hair and clothes. I took a lot of inspiration from anime scenes and spent some time practicing to understand how the hair was animated. And this is one of the animation I did before doing the Utahime cut. I also learned a lot from this animator named Dong Chung, especially from his video how to animate blowing hair. If you guys want to learn more about Japanese animation, I highly recommend checking out his channel. But basically the way I animated the hair was by drawing a line connected to the upper part of the head and using it as a guide for the movement. I would move the upper part of the hair first since it's the closest to the part where the hair is connected, and then I would have the lower part follow the next frame, which creates a delayed movement and it makes the hair feel more natural. This way of animating hair and clothes helped me in a lot of cuts throughout this animation. Most of the cuts that are still frame have this kind of movement, and in my opinion, it really makes everything feel more alive. Also, in those cuts of Ichiji, instead of just making the clothes and the hair move, I also animated the shadows to simulate subtle changes in the lighting, which helped make the scene feel more dynamic. Okay, so these cuts of Utahime dancing were kinda tricky for me to do, and I'll explain why starting with the first cut. So in this cut, we see Utahime rotating her feet, and let me tell you, drawing feet is very hard for me since I have zero experience with that. Generally when I animate characters, they always have boots or stuff like this, so it's really hard for me to animate. Another way I added weight to this animation was by playing with the timing. Let's look at this cut for example. The first few frames are animated in ones, so 24 FPS, but then it goes to 12 FPS, then 8, then you get the point. The further we get in this animation, the lower the frame rate is, and the reason why I chose this approach is because it's a good way to convey the slow motion effect without having to draw like hundreds of frames. Next up is a series of cuts where Gojo is preparing his hollow purple attack. I used the same hair animation and slow motion technique I talked about in the previous cuts, but this particular shot was a nightmare to animate because of the way Gojo rotates and because of the perspective of the drawing. Making the character move like this is hard because I had to maintain the correct proportions from frame to frame, so I had to do a lot of adjustments in every frame. When you look at the drawing without any shading or effects, you can clearly notice some of the issues. To help hide them and make the animation feel smoother, I used the smears in the shading inspired by the work of Yutaka Nakamura. This type of shading makes the drawings look nicer and makes the imperfection less noticeable in my opinion. What made these cuts way better was the effect animation, more precisely the electricity. The way I drew the electricity was by changing the thickness of the brush, and in some areas where the lines don't connect, the lines are thinner, but when the lines connect, it's way thicker. And another thing I did to create the flickering effect from the electricity was making it so the electricity appears in one frame and disappears in the other. In order to make the cut of Gojo unleashing his attack more powerful, I created a feeling of anticipation by animating the effect animation glowing slowly and the scene becoming brighter, and then I drew some impact frames using smears and black and white to create a huge contrast. The impact frames really make this animation more interesting to look at, and if you don't believe me, just take a look at the animation with and without the impact frames. For the hollow purple shots, I tried to be as creative as possible. I used smears to animate the ground, I changed the size of the ball to make it feel like it was moving at a very quick speed, and I added electricity around it, and a lot of other effects to still the destruction happening throughout the city. One cut that shows all of this really well is this one. This shot was one of the most time consuming because I had to make sure the explosions and debris followed the moving background. It also contains far more effect animation than the other cuts. cuts. I first animated the smoke and debris from the hollow purple on the layer behind the buildings. Then I added another layer of smoke and explosion in front of them. On top of that, I included more electricity, debris, and other explosions to make the destruction feel more believable. Overall, I think this ended up being one of the strongest cuts in the entire animation. Now, one of the coolest part of my animation is the explosion, and I started this cut by drawing impact frames. In those impact frames, I drew the silhouette of the buildings and I added lines that followed the perspective of the explosion. And to sell the explosion even more, I added a perspective blur. Drawing the explosion wasn't hard, unlike drawing the characters, but it was just really time consuming because again, I had to draw like 5 layers of effect animation and there was a lot of frames to draw. What really made the explosion more impactful was the timing and the compositing. With the timing, I was able to make the animation go from 24 to 3 FPS, which made the explosion go really fast in the beginning and then it made it slow down at the end. The compositing also added a lot of intensity because I added bright colors in the beginning of the explosion and then I made it so the colors fade as the explosion slowed down. More on the compositing later. For all these cuts of the aftermath, I animated the drawings of the smoke and I made these drawings change slightly to create a sense of slow movement. There are a small number of frames because it would be very hard and time consuming to draw more frames than this for slow cuts of animation that are about 3 seconds long. Each of these cuts have around 8 frames for the smoke cloud, but they have other layers. At this point of the animation, I had to animate the meeting between Gojo and Sukuna, which meant I had to animate Sukuna walking. Since we do not see his lower body in this cut, I animated his arms swinging and his body rotating slowly as his body moves up and down. Getting the proportions to look decent was kind of hard, but animating this was even more challenging. Not only did I have to animate Sukuna walking, but I also had to animate his position changing constantly. I won't go over this next cut of Gojo and Sukuna talking in detail, but basically a lot of them are still framed with hair movement or slow movement like the head rotating slightly or the hands moving slightly. But I do want to go over this cut of Sukuna. It might not look like it, but this cut is kind of complex because it has 4 layers. The first layer is the hair, and the reason why it's behind is because when Sukuna moves his head, the animation layer follows his movement. But since Sukuna's hair is slick back, I don't need to have the hair layer in front of his face. The second layer is his face, the third layer is his clothes, and the last one is the shading. The hard part about this cut was animating the movement of the face, making the hair movement match with the face, and putting it all together in After Effects. And on top of all of this, Sukuna was talking and laughing during this cut. This meant I had to separate the mouth from the other layers in After Effects. Now we can finally start talking about the epic cuts from the fight, and there's no better place to begin than this shot of Sukuna bursting towards Gojo. This cut starts at 24 FPS, and then when Sukuna's flying towards the camera, one frame is animated on 1s, so 24 FPS, and the other is animated on 2s, so 12 FPS. It switches between the two basically. The technique I use for this animation to convey speed is that the characters zoom slowly while the clothes and the hair move quickly. This is a technique Yutaka Nakamura and Masayuki Kunihiro use a lot, and it's also a technique I use in this cut of Gojo sliding. In this cut, the ground is moving rapidly, and the way I illustrated that is with smear frames. The ground is animated on 1s, while Gojo is animated on 2s and 3s and even lower frame rates at the end. The smoke, on the other hand, is animated at a higher frame rate and moves more quickly. You can also see that the clothes and the hair are moving at a faster rate than his body. And it's for the same reason as the Sukuna cut I talked about previously, to convey speed. Speaking of speed, the cut that conveys speed the most is this one. But this was more of an experimental cut, but it still ended up being in the animation anyways. In this cut, Sukuna is very simplified, the lines are thicker and use smears, and more importantly, I added brush strokes to give even more intensity to the animation. I took inspiration from this cut from Gurren Lagann. This cut is the first fight choreography between Gojo and Sukuna. The way I animated it was by drawing the key poses first. For example, when Sukuna throws a kick and Gojo dodges it, that's one key pose. Then I drew the next key pose where Sukuna prepares to punch Gojo, followed by the pose where Gojo parries his attack. After drawing those key poses, I animated the camera by adding zooms, pullbacks, and I positioned the characters correctly and fixed some of the drawing's issues. Once this was done, I created the clean line art and added the in-between frames. This cut took me over 2 days to complete, even though it's only about 3 seconds of animation. The cuts after this have slow motion, hair movement, impact frames, and they all lead to this cut, which I think is one of the best cuts of the entire animation. The cut of Sukuna getting sent flying. This one was kinda hard to make because I had to do the background in 3D in After Effects, and by the way, I'll explain how I did these backgrounds in the compositing part, but the point is that I had to make the camera spin while it was moving forward. And the goal here was to animate Sukuna without making him rotate too much, since the camera is already locked on him. So I animated the shadows so it looks like he's rotating. Now, I could have used a still frame and only animate his clothes and hair, but that would have felt too stiff, and so I made his body rotate slightly and I pulled him back progressively, so it really feels like he's getting sent flying. After that, I added quick wind to give the animation a feeling of intense speed. After that, I animated the cut of Sukuna sliding in the ground, and here the 3D background really elevates the animation in my opinion. Again, this time, I used the technique of having Sukuna's body move slowly while his clothes and hair move quickly. And I added a trail of wind along with debris to show the impact his body has on the ground when he's sliding. I also took inspiration from the sliding animation we see from Kunihiro's animation. For this cut of Gojo running towards Sukuna while breaking the ground, I decided to animate the background first because I already had an idea of how the characters would move. I then animated the key poses of Gojo running and added anticipation before he slammed his foot into the ground. I created that anticipation by lifting his arms and having his right foot push him upward while he prepares his attack with his left foot. I looked at reference of people jumping and used similar poses to make it feel like Gojo is gathering as much momentum as possible before bringing his foot on the ground. And obviously, we can't forget about the effect animation, because without it, the animation loses all its impact. I created 4 layers of effect animation, and 1 for the debris, and 3 for the smoke and explosion effects. And I use a circular shape to create the explosion and smoke effects. The next cut is, in my opinion, one of, if not the best cut in the animation. And the reason why is because it's pretty similar to the cut with the fight choreography between Gojo and Sukuna. But this time, it has a 3D background and the camera rotates around the 2 characters. Since I said I was going to talk about the 3D later in the video, I'll just say one thing about this background. It was really hard for me to pull off. You guys may not know this, but this project was the first time I used 3D. And since I suck at Blender, I decided to use 3D in After Effects since it's easier for me. But you have way less options than Blender. But yeah, making the camera rotate was really hard, as you can see from this early version of the 3D background. But you know what was even more time consuming? Animating the characters. Since Gojo and Sukuna were constantly moving on this 3D environment, I had to change their angle slightly every frame as I animated them throwing punches, dodging attacks and parrying attacks. So, I can tell you there are a lot of imperfections, but the fact that they're always moving and that the camera movement is more dynamic makes this cut stand out from the other. This cut took me 3 days for 2 seconds of animation, but it was worth the struggle, and I'm pretty proud of this one. This one was also complex, but not on the same level as the one I just talked about. In this cut of Gojo jumping from the bridge, I started by animating the background by separating every asset. I cut the bridge in 3 layers and the ground in 1 layer. After Gojo jumped, the middle part of the bridge is not moving, but the left part and the right part are moving away from the middle part. And at the same time, I made it so that the background zoomed out, and I also added a shake to give more impact to the destruction. For this animation of Gojo jumping, the hardest part was drawing Gojo again because of the perspective and the foreshortening. The foreshortening technique consists of making the object close to the camera bigger while the rest is smaller, and this is used to create an illusion of depth. And in my opinion, it makes it even harder to get my proportions right because it deforms the character. Personally, I think I did a decent job at conveying the perspective effect, but the movement could have been better. But again, this time the effect animation saved the cut because it made the background feel less like a PowerPoint presentation. This cut shows Gojo again, and this time he's throwing the middle part of the bridge where Sukuna is standing. At the beginning of the animation, Gojo prepared his attack, so I made his left arm move upward while his body moves backward. Then I added smears to create quick movement, and after that it slows down again. With these kinds of animation, you can think of it as an ease in, ease out transition. It's slow at the beginning, fast in the middle, and slow at the end again. Then, for this cut of the bridge being destroyed by Sukuna, I added 10 impact frames. Before the impact, you can see Sukuna move very quickly, but he's blurry. For the impact frames, I used a pencil brush to make them feel like they were drawn on paper and give them a less digital look. After that, I animated the bridge being cut into 24 pieces. I only draw small numbers of frames to create the slow motion effect, since it would have been too hard to redraw it so many times because of how detailed the bridge is. However, I did add a camera shake effect and some wind animation to give it even more impact. After this, there is a cut with an explosion, and I also animated the camera movement first on this one and then used the anticipation technique before Sukuna jumped, and it led to this cut, which took a lot of time. Just to give you an idea of how long this took, I had to draw 24 individual drawings of Sukuna, and one drawing of this quality can take anywhere from 20 to 50 minutes to make, without even taking the shading and colors into account. So yeah, it was a nightmare. Plus, Sukuna was talking during this animation, so I had to animate his mouth, matching his voice lines while he was moving. Also, the movement in this animation was much more complex, because Sukuna is rotating during the entire animation, which meant I had to constantly change the angle of his body and adjust the angle of his right arm toward the end. But once I had drawn the key poses correctly, I was able to create decent in-between animation. Because of the high number of drawings though, a lot of them have proportions error. I tried to fix some of them, but it was really hard. And I think overall, what made this cut stand out was the number of frames, the timing, the use of smears, the impact frames, and all of this leads to the next cut. Believe it or not, this is actually a different cut. The impact frame serves as a transition between the two. And what I like about this cut is the simplicity of the dismantle attack and the way I drew it. For the dismantle attack, I use a straight line to show the sharpness of the attack, and I added smear lines that follow the perspective of the camera, which makes it feel like the attack is moving at full speed, and it really gives it volume too. Then I animated Gojo, and the way I did that was by drawing him with simplified drawings when he was farther away, and adding more complexity as he came closer to the camera. In the final drawing, I just animated his hair and I added a slight twitch movement to his eyes. And for the cut of the building being sliced, it was actually pretty easy to pull off. I just separated the building into two parts. I animated the upper part falling in After Effects, and the lower part wasn't really moving. And then I drew the explosion, and as you can see, it's pretty simplified, but I also added a layer of wind effect animation and bright compositing to give the explosion more strength. Now, the next two cuts I'm going to show you are, in my opinion, also some of the best cuts in my animation. And we'll start with this cut of Gojo getting punched inside the building. The animation technique I used in this cut was to make the animation quick at the beginning and slow it down so the viewer can process what just happened. I also used the same technique of making the hair and the clothes move at a faster pace than the body. But what elevated this cut again, and in the next one too, is the 3D background. I designed the doors, the ceiling, and the floor of this hallway, and I placed them as 3D planes in After Effects and made the camera move at the same pace as the animation. The camera moves quickly at the beginning and slows down at the end, and I did the same thing for the Sukuna cut. The glass shattering and the vibrant compositing really elevated the animation even more. For the punch animation here, it's pretty similar to the animation of Gojo throwing the bridge, since I used the same ideas of anticipation and smears to make the movement feel more powerful. For the explosion, I also used a technique that I already used in previous cuts. I think it's pretty normal when making a long animation like this, because once you find techniques that work well, you can reuse them and adapt them to different situations. Now, we are at the final part of the animation, and there are 4 cuts I want to focus on. The first one is another 3D cut, and I think it does a great job of showing just how powerful Sukuna is. As you can see, Gojo is getting sent flying in this scene, and what makes it so intense is that he lands on the ground on his back, bounces back into the air, and keeps flying away while Sukuna prepares his next attack. The exaggerated perspective created by the 3D backgrounds make the scene feel so much more dynamic. And on top of all of this, the wind and smear frames, which are mostly animated in 24 FPS, add a lot of speed, and I think they really help to sell the impact of the attack. The second cut I wanted to talk about is this cut of Sukuna sliding and bursting forward again. This is yet another good example of how anticipation can make an animation feel more impactful. After getting sent back by the explosion, Sukuna slows down to prepare to push his body towards Gojo. I added a small moment where he lifts his hands up and uses the force of his entire body to prepare his next movement. This creates anticipation and makes the burst forward feel much faster and much more powerful. I also animated another explosion and added debris around him to just show how strong Sukuna is. The two last cuts are linked and are the final cuts of the animation where Gojo and Sukuna are preparing their domain expansion. For these cuts, I had to make sure the proportions were accurate to the manga because I wanted to create something similar to the clash between Yuta, Ryu and Uro in the anime. I wanted to add the thick line work and add the speed lines effect. The reason why these cuts were so time consuming is because I had to draw each characters 4 times with the same amount of detail and precision. I had to make each drawing slightly different to make it look like they were shaking. If I used still frame, it wouldn't feel as organic, but drawing 4 frames for one character means 8 frames in total for Gojo and Sukuna because they were technically separated into different cuts. On top of that, I had to draw another 8 frames for the close-up of their eyes, which as you can see are also pretty detailed. Now, since this cut has a different type of compositing, I'll explain it here. So I had to create a lot of layers of lines that I drew in Flip-A-Clip, and I also added a glow around the characters and faded shadows around them. This part was a bit time consuming, but not nearly as much as the animation itself, and I think it was really fun since I really enjoy doing the compositing part. And that is pretty much it for the animation part. Now obviously there are some cuts that I skipped, but a lot of them are pretty similar, or there are cuts where I don't have much more to add because it would become repetitive. Now I'll explain how I did the compositing in general for this animation. This part is very important because it makes the visual look more cinematic, and the way I make my animation go from this to this is by using blending modes in After Effects. Generally, the first thing I would do is create a solid layer that fills the frame with one color. I usually go for a dark blue color and set it to multiply, which makes the frame darker. Then I use an image of a blurry circle on a black background, which I use as the light source. For most of this animation, the blurry circle was used as the sunlight, and I gave it an orange color, and I set the layer to the color dodge blending mode, which made the light source feel more realistic. The reason why it feels more realistic is because between the shadow and the light, you get a more vibrant saturated color. If I just use overlay or I just use the PNG, it wouldn't be as vibrant. I also controlled the amount of light and animated the light effects by increasing and lowering the exposure, which was really useful for explosions and fight scenes. Another part of the compositing was the 3D backgrounds, which were made with 2D planes. It was really hard, but I tried my best to create buildings and bridges using these textures. Some parts were easier because they were just flat ground. For the cuts that have intense movement, I created this environment in 3D and used the camera to move through the 3D space. However, the camera movement is a bit limited because it's kind of hard to control in After Effects, in my opinion. But since it was my first time trying this, I think I will be much better next time. The other thing the camera allowed me to do was create a parallax effect, which added a lot of depth to the background of my animation. And the last thing I want to talk about is the audio part of this project. The voice acting was done by Nick Atlas, and he provided the voice for Gojo, Sukuna, the narrator, and Ichiji. He was the first person I contacted because I needed the voices before working on a lot of cuts in my animation. With his voice acting, I was able to create the storyboard, which I could then give to the music producer. The music was done by 100 Cents, and I asked him to make tracks inspired by the Jujutsu Kaisen OST, but not direct covers. I wanted songs that would match my storyboard and the emotion I was trying to convey. Once the production was finished, I worked on the sound effects, which I downloaded from Epidemic Sounds and layered in Premiere Pro. Audio is way more important than people think, and I think it really elevated the animation. So I want to thank Nick Atlas and 100 Cents for their amazing work. And there you have it. This is how I created the Gojo vs Sukuna project. I want to thank you guys so much for 1 million views again, and for all the likes and comments. It really gives me a lot of motivation to keep going. I also want to tell you guys that part 2 is not confirmed because I want to focus on other things, but I am considering making it. For now, I want to take a little break from JJK and make some shorter animation videos for this channel before going back to a big project like this, since it was a huge commitment. If you guys have suggestions for what I could animate for my next video or any constructive criticism for this animation project, leave them in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, you can leave a like and subscribe. It would help me out so much. Thank you so much for the support, and I'll see you in the next one.